Last week, Tracy Borman, Tim Thornton, and actor John Watkins presented intriguing new evidence about the fate of the princes in the Tower. This evidence comes from the 1516 will of a woman named Margaret Chapell. In her will, she mentioned a chain that once belonged to King Edward V, the elder of the princes in the Tower. The relevant section of the will reads, "His Faders, William Capell chain, which was young King Edward V's, to have the foresaid stuff and chain during his life with reasonable wearing upon that condition, that after his decease, I will that YT remain and be kept by men executors to the use of Henry Capell and Edward Capell from one to another, and for default of these two children, I will that my daughter, Elizabeth Paulet, shall have the foresaid goods." In my recent video, I explored this evidence and shared my thoughts on whether it constitutes the smoking gun that Borman so vividly described. Naturally, the most pressing question on everyone's mind was, how did the chain end up with the Capell family? As many readers of my community tab already know, I began investigating and uncovered some fascinating details. However, I must emphasize that what I am presenting is just the starting point of serious research, not its conclusion. My findings are based solely on catalogue descriptions from the National Archives for dozens of relevant sources. Anyone aiming to fully solve this mystery will need to consult the original documents themselves, rather than relying solely on summaries. Please understand this video as a guidepost, a suggestion of the direction this research could take, rather than a definitive resolution. Properly analyzing all the sources will likely take months and require the efforts of more than one person. While I can contribute by examining some family wills, let's not get ahead of ourselves. The road to uncovering the truth is long, and this is just the beginning. Before I begin, I need to address something, much like History Calling did in her video about the documentary, after being informed about it by one of her patrons. It's important to note that Tim Thornton wasn't the first person to discover the will or the mention of the chain. That distinction belongs to Susan James, who included it in her book Women's Voices in Tudor Wills, published in 2016. I don't want to dwell on this too much, but let's just say it's less than ideal that a female historian unearthed this remarkable find, only for it to go largely unacknowledged, while a man later appears in a documentary and receives widespread praise online. To be clear, I'm not trying to diminish Thornton's contributions. It's fantastic that he also found the will and helped bring it the attention it deserves. However, Susan James deserves the lion's share of the credit for this discovery. I'll leave it at that. Let's continue with the cleanup. In the discussion under my first video, there was debate about whether chains of office were a thing. Borman and Thornton had described the chain mentioned in the will as a chain of office. However, the will itself does not specify that it was a chain of office. Since the documentary aired, both Borman and Thornton have been interviewed by History Extra, and in this interview, the term of office no longer appears. Thornton now explains his discovery with these words. In this period, chains were very valuable and significant items. They would be made of precious metal and jewels, and usually incorporated badges or symbols to express the owner's identity and loyalties. But was there such a thing as a chain of office? The answer is both yes and no. English kings and queens didn't have a specific chain that was part of their formal regalia as monarchs. However, they all wore individual chains. I provide several examples of late medieval and Tudor monarchs depicted in paintings wearing chains, which I've marked for reference. These images clearly show that no king or queen reused an older chain. Instead, monarchs had chains made for them or received them as gifts, which they used to complete their royal attire. While not a requirement, every monarch seemed to wear one, and it's reasonable to assume Edward V was no exception. And just to put this possibility out there, perhaps this is how Margaret Chapell and her husband knew the chain belonged to Edward. They may have seen him wearing it, for instance, when he arrived in London. When the chain came into their possession, they might have recognized it and made the connection. This brings us to the man who acquired the chain, William Capell. Capell was a merchant operating in Calais, a sheriff of the City of London in 1496, and Lord Mayor of London in both 1503 and 1510. He also represented London in Parliament. Notably, his wife, Margaret, was the half-sister of Anne Tyrell, who passed away in 1486. Capell had business connections with the House of York, particularly with John de la Pole. However, his relationship with the Tudors was, to put it mildly, complicated. In 1507, he was imprisoned under accusations of failing to address forfeited money adequately. Furthermore, Henry VIII explicitly excluded Capell from the general pardons issued at the beginning of his reign. Despite this, the Archbishop of Canterbury pardoned him, and Henry later approved the decision retroactively. Capell also had ties to Queen Elizabeth of York, to whom he once loaned £100, a debt her husband repaid on her behalf. His son Giles served Henry VIII during the war against France, earning a knighthood. Unlike his father, Giles seemed to enjoy Henry's favour, a relationship that remained strong throughout the king's reign. Returning to William Capell, he appears to have had a penchant for legal disputes. He frequently sued and was often sued in return. While he borrowed considerable sums of money, he acted as a creditor in even more cases. His family also had numerous legal troubles. For instance, during William's lifetime, Giles was hit with 2 massive fines of £1,000 and £800, with William contributing at least £100 toward one of them. Capell's penchant for risk extended to his public life. He was present at the 1494 feast marking Henry VII's creation as Duke of York. His actions suggest a man who relished the court's inner workings and wasn't shy about walking a fine line between legal and questionable behavior. After learning about William Capell, he strikes me as someone who wasn't the most virtuous individual. He appeared willing to take significant risks for personal gain, as evidenced by his multiple pardons. It's not hard to imagine him as the type of person who might covet an item once belonging to the princes in the Tower, regardless of the potential risks involved. In general, there are 4 possible ways William Capell could have come into possession of the chain. First, he was the last person to be with Edward. Second, he knew the last person who was with Edward and obtained the chain from them. Third, the chain was returned to Edward's family after whatever happened to him occurred, and William acquired it from the family. Fourth, after the prince's disappearance, their belongings were sold off, and William purchased the chain, possibly because he recognized it. If William Capell wasn't John Dighton, the still unidentified murderer mentioned by Thomas More, I find it hard to believe he was directly involved in what happened to Edward V and his younger brother Richard. Thornton suggested in his History Extra interview that the prince's belongings might have been sold off. However, I find this unlikely. Margaret Chapell specifically names Edward in her will, indicating she knew whose chain it was. This suggests one of 2 things. Either the sellers disclosed the nature of the items they were selling, or the chain was easily recognizable. If either scenario were true, it seems likely that such a sale would have left more historical evidence, which we would know about today. While I can't completely rule out the possibility of the chain being sold, I will focus my attention on the other 2 explanations. Let's begin by considering Edward's family as the source of the chain. His cousin, Richard Grey, the 3rd Earl of Kent, owed at least £3,000 to William Capell, a staggering sum at the time. This Richard Grey was the son of Anne Woodville, sister of Elizabeth Woodville, and is unrelated to Edward's half-brother of the same name, who was executed by Richard III in June 1483. There are claims that Richard Grey had a gambling addiction, though I could not verify this. What is clear is that his father was also indebted to the Capells and had openly criticized William for his ruthless lending practices. Ultimately, Richard Grey was unable to repay his debts, leading to the confiscation of his belongings by the Crown and their subsequent transfer to William. If Edward's chain had been passed down to Richard Grey's family, it's plausible that it ended up as some form of pawn or security deposit with Capell. According to Richard Grey's Wikipedia entry, Capell accepted jewellery from goldsmith Simon Garretson as security in 1498, though I couldn't verify this claim. Nevertheless, it's well documented that Capell accepted various goods as repayment from his debtors, so it's reasonable to assume he would have accepted a chain as well. It's also plausible that Anne Woodville, as Edward's aunt, was entrusted with the prince's belongings, particularly if the boys weren't killed, but instead smuggled out of the country. At the time, Elizabeth Woodville and her daughters were in sanctuary. Thomas Grey was in France, and her brothers Anthony and Lionel were either deceased or also in sanctuary. As the oldest surviving sibling, Anne would have been a logical choice to safeguard such possessions. Additionally, Anne's husband, George Grey, had a favourable relationship with Richard III, evidenced by his being made a Knight of the Bath by the King in July 1483. This event would have provided a discreet opportunity for Richard to transfer the prince's belongings to the couple, as gift exchanges were common on such occasions. In my humble opinion, the more likely explanation is that the chain was given to Capell by a member of Sir James Tyrell's family. Anne Tyrell, William Capell's sister-in-law, isn't the strongest candidate for this, as she passed away in 1486. However, the two families remained close and continued to engage in numerous business dealings. One particularly intriguing figure is Thomas Tyrell, the son and heir of Sir James Tyrell. A source dated November 24, 1507, notes that Thomas owed 200 marks to William Capell. He is explicitly identified as James Tyrell's son and heir. When Thomas was unable to repay this debt, an inquisition and return commission were initiated to evaluate his estates. This process involved cataloguing his belongings and estimating their value to satisfy Capell's claim. If the Tyrell family had possession of Edward's chain, this loan provides a compelling explanation for how it might have ended up with the Capells. The connection between the two families persisted over time. Thomas and Giles Capell were cousins after all, and the Capells' financial support for the Tyrells is a relationship worth noting. In my community tab, I speculated that the link between the Capells and Thomas More would be the next major reveal. It happened much sooner than I expected. Just a few hours after my post, the History Extra interview was published, in which Thornton discusses John More, Thomas More's father, serving as the Capell family lawyer during the 1510s. Their connection, however, goes back further. John More was one of the judges tasked with handling Capell's case during his imprisonment in 1507. That same year, they jointly received a grant. John More also served alongside Capell on a commission. We know that Thomas More used his father John as a source for his work on Richard III. Given the close relationship between John More and William Capell, it's conceivable that the information about Tyrell's alleged confession in 1502 could have originated with Capell, who might have heard it from Thomas Tyrell. However, it's worth noting that Robert Fabyan, who wrote another chronicle during this period, also had ties to Capell. Despite this connection, Fabyan didn't mention Tyrell in his work. Over time, Fabyan's relationship with Capell soured, ultimately culminating in a lawsuit. I leave it to you to decide what to make of this. Another question regarding the chain is, what happened to it? Is it mentioned in other wills? I reviewed all the wills of the male Capells up to 1588, including William Capell's own will. The chain is not explicitly mentioned in any of them. However, I must add one caveat. I struggled to decipher parts of Sir Giles Capell's will due to the difficulty of reading the handwriting. It's also important to note that the absence of a specific mention of the chain in the wills doesn't necessarily mean it wasn't included. Wills often use broad collective phrases like, "I will that my son gets everything he finds in the manner of A or B." Such wording could easily have encompassed the chain without naming it directly. Additionally, the wills I reviewed are copies rather than the originals. These copies were made by the authorities or the church to serve as records, particularly in case of disputes. This was the case with William Capell's will, which became the subject of legal contention. In the surviving records, it's evident that one will ends and another, belonging to a different person, begins on the same page. It's possible that the original will reference the chain, but this detail may have been omitted in the copied version. However, Margaret Chapell's will proves that such information could be included, as her reference to the chain made it into the official copy. This leaves some room for speculation. So, what should we make of all this? I think it's fair to say that Thomas More's account appears more plausible now. I'm not claiming that he wrote the truth or that Richard killed the princes, but we do have a solid link connecting the Tyrell family to Thomas More. It's possible that More learned of the confession through his father's relationship with the Capells. Again, I'm not accusing anyone of murder here, but the connection between the chain and the Capells makes it plausible that James Tyrell may have played a role in the fate of the princes in the Tower, whatever that may have been. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.